What would you do if I told you one of the biggest police corruption scandals in New Zealand history may have started with a toddler left alone in a blood-stained farmhouse? Not with a gun, not with a confession, not with a suspect, but with a baby. Because before detectives ever arrested Arthur Allan Thomas, before 2 separate juries convicted him, before a royal commission accused senior detectives of planting evidence, there was one question that should have dominated the entire investigation. Who kept Rochelle Crewe alive? Hold on to that image. We're going to come back to it. Every country has a case that changes the way people look at their justice system. For the United States, many would point to O.J. Simpson. In the United Kingdom, perhaps the Birmingham Six. Here in New Zealand, one of those cases is the Crewe murders. A case that began with 2 brutal murders, ended with a royal commission finding that police had fabricated evidence, and left one question hanging over our justice system that remains unanswered more than 50 years later. If police framed the wrong man, who murdered Harvey and Jeannette Crewe? Our story begins in Pukekawa, a small farming community about 70 kilometres south of Auckland on New Zealand's North Island. It's the sort of place where people know their neighbours, where roads disappear between rolling green hills, and where in 1970 a double murder was almost unthinkable. Harvey and Jeannette Crewe lived there with their 18-month-old daughter Rochelle. By all accounts, they were an ordinary young farming family. Harvey was 28, Jeannette was 30. They were trying to build a future together. Nothing about them suggested they were about to become the centre of one of New Zealand's most controversial criminal investigations. On Wednesday, 17th of June 1970, Harvey and Jeannette attended a local stock sale. Harvey bought a bull. Later that evening, the stock agent tried ringing the farmhouse to arrange the delivery. Nobody answered. At the time, nobody thought much of it. Out in rural New Zealand, missing a phone call wasn't unusual, especially in the 1970s. People were outside, working, fixing fences, milking cows. One unanswered phone call didn't mean anything. Until it became 2. Then 3, then 4. As the days passed, friends couldn't reach them, family couldn't reach them, and neighbours began noticing something wasn't right. The Crews had simply vanished. Now, if you're anything like me, this is where the first alarm bells start ringing. People don't usually disappear without leaving something behind. A vehicle, a message, tyre tracks, some indication of where they've gone. But when concern finally became too great, family members went to the farmhouse. And what they found changed everything. On Monday, the 22nd of June, around 4.5 days after Harvey and Jeannette are believed to have been murdered, the front door was opened. Inside there was blood. Blood on the floor, blood in the living room. Investigators would later find brain tissue on a chair. Evidence suggested that Harvey had probably been sitting there when he was shot from behind. There were signs parts of the scene had been cleaned, signs somebody had tried to erase what had happened. Then someone opened the bedroom door. Inside was 18-month-old Rochelle. Alive. Just stop and picture that scene for a moment. You've walked into what appears to be a murder house. The parents are gone, there's blood inside, the silence is overwhelming. And in a cot, a little girl was still waiting for mum and dad to come home. It's one of the most heartbreaking scenes in New Zealand criminal history. But it should also have become one of the investigation's most important pieces of evidence. You'll often hear people summarise this part of the story in one sentence. Someone came back and fed the baby. It's dramatic, it's memorable. But it's also a massive oversimplification. Because the real question isn't whether that sentence sounds compelling. The real question is, how do we know? How do we know Rochelle hadn't simply survived on her own? What evidence suggested somebody had returned? And perhaps more importantly, what did police actually do to investigate that possibility? Once you start asking those questions, this case becomes much stranger than most people realise. When Rochelle was found, she'd clearly been neglected. Her clothing was heavily soiled, her nappies hadn't been changed for days. And she was distressed, dirty and dehydrated. Nobody disputes that. But doctors examining Rochelle also noticed something unexpected. her condition wasn't quite what they would expect if she'd spent almost 5 straight days without receiving any food or water. One doctor estimated she'd lost somewhere between half a kilogram and 1 kilogram. Years later, paediatric specialist Professor Carol Jenny reviewed the original medical evidence. One small detail stood out. Rochelle's nappies were still wet, suggesting she'd received fluids at some point after her parents disappeared. Not proper care, not enough to keep her healthy, just enough to keep her alive. Now I want to be straight with you here, because this detail is genuinely contested. When police carried out their own review of the case in 2014, they went back over Professor Jenny's finding and ultimately sided with the original 1970s doctors, concluding Rochelle likely hadn't been fed at all. Here's the strange part. The review's own analysis admitted Professor Jenny's reading was more credible, given her decades of experience with child neglect. They sided with the older evidence anyway. So take that however you want. Even the medical evidence in this case can't agree with itself. That one detail rewrites everything else about those 5 days. If somebody entered that farmhouse after Harvey and Jeannette had already been murdered, then they walked through a house containing blood. They saw clear evidence that something terrible had happened. They found Rochelle, gave her a drink, then quietly walked away. No call to police, no call to neighbours. No call to anyone. If that's true, whoever returned already knew something horrific had happened inside that house. And to me, that's where this investigation starts taking a very strange turn. Because you'd expect detectives to become obsessed with one question: who went back to that farmhouse? Who had access? Who knew the family well enough to walk inside without attracting attention? And why leave Rochelle alive and not say anything about her parents? Those aren't minor questions. These are potentially direct links to whoever entered the murder scene after the killings. Yet according to later independent reviews, those possibilities were never investigated. Instead, the investigation slowly began looking somewhere else. And before long, one local farmer would become the centre of everything. But before we get to Arthur Allan Thomas, we need to understand just how badly this investigation began. What happened during those first few days didn't just influence the case, it may have poisoned everything from the very beginning. So let's go back to the start and follow the evidence exactly the way the investigators should have. If the first few days of any murder investigation are the most important, then the Crewe investigation was already in serious trouble. Because a crime scene only gets one chance to tell its story. Every footprint, every fingerprint, every bloodstain, every fibre, every tyre track, every tiny detail has the potential to identify a killer. Once that scene's contaminated, you never get that opportunity back. And that's exactly what happened here. Leading the investigation were 2 men whose names you're going to hear many times before this episode is over. Detective Inspector Bruce Hutton and his colleague, Detective Sergeant Lenrick Johnson. Right now, they're simply 2 experienced officers working a difficult case in a small farming community. Remember those names. By the end of this episode, they'll mean something very different to New Zealand policing. One of the most damning criticisms ever levelled at this investigation wasn't made by Arthur Allan Thomas. It wasn't made by journalists or conspiracy theorists. It came from people who later reviewed the police investigation itself. Their conclusion: the crime scene management was grossly substandard. Think about those words. Not imperfect, not flawed, not below par. Grossly substandard. That's an extraordinary criticism in a double murder investigation. I've read a lot of case files putting this series together. That phrase doesn't show up often, and when it does, it is never good. So what actually went wrong? People moved through the farmhouse before it had been properly secured. Items appeared inside the crime scene that shouldn't have been there. A police notebook sitting on the dining room table in one photo, clothing lying on the scene in another. Now you might look at that and think, so what? The crime scene investigators will tell you exactly why it matters. Every object introduced into a scene creates uncertainty. Was it already there? Who touched it? When did it arrive? Every unnecessary person, every unnecessary object makes it harder to separate genuine evidence from contamination. And in a murder investigation, that uncertainty is so dangerous. Then came something even harder to explain. Near a wheelbarrow investigators believe may have been used to move Harvey Crewe's body, police photographed what appeared to be a piece of fabric sitting beside an object that may have transported a murder victim. Today, that would be treated as forensic gold. Photographed, bagged, DNA and fibre tested, compared against suspects and vehicles. Instead, it disappeared. One explanation later suggested it may accidentally have caught fire from a detective's cigarette. Seriously, that was an explanation. The later independent review rejected that outright, describing the disappearance as unacceptable. Once again, potential crucial evidence had vanished before anyone could look at it. Now let me ask you something. If this was your family, would that be good enough? Because it sure wouldn't be for me. 2 people have been murdered. A toddler's been left alone for days. The crime scene may contain the only clues to identify the killer, and evidence is already disappearing. We're still only at the beginning of this investigation, and already it's starting to unravel. Initially, police focused their attention on someone much closer to home. Len Demler, Jeanette's father. When Demler entered the farmhouse, investigators later questioned aspects of his behaviour. He didn't immediately call the police. He left Rochelle inside the house while he went somewhere else. Later on, he returned with a neighbour. Detective Inspector Bruce Hutton even suggested to Demler that he believed Demler had removed Harvey's body from the farmhouse. Now that's a remarkable accusation. That tells us something important. At this stage, police clearly believed someone close to the family had been involved. But despite extensive investigation, they couldn't make the evidence fit. There was suspicion, but suspicion isn't proof. Eventually, the investigation turned in another direction. About 25 kilometres southeast of Pukekawa lived another local farmer. His name was Arthur Allan Thomas. Like most people living in rural Waikato, Thomas knew the Crewe family. Years earlier, before Jeannette married Harvey, Thomas had been keen on her. The prosecution would later rely heavily on their history, suggesting it showed motive, obsession. But here's where I think we need to slow down again, because motive isn't evident. Lots of people experience rejection. Very few commit double murder. So let's ask the obvious question. What actually connected Arthur Allan Thomas to that crime scene? At this point, almost nothing. There's no eyewitnesses, no confession, no fingerprints. No blood belonging to Harvey or Jeannette. No forensic evidence placing Thomas inside the farmhouse. His wife Vivian had an alibi. She knew where he'd been that night. He'd been with her. Police still suspected him. But suspicion alone doesn't convict someone. Not in a courtroom, not if the justice system is working properly. So detectives needed something else, something tangible, something scientific, something a jury could hold on to. They began collecting firearms from around the district. One of them was Arthur Allan Thomas's .22. Initially, nothing remarkable happened. The rifle was examined, then returned. Investigators continued exploring other possible murder weapons. At this stage, Thomas's rifle wasn't even the leading candidate. The investigation was still open. Multiple possibilities still existed. And then, everything changed. From this point onwards, the entire investigation would revolve around one tiny piece of brass. A single spent cartridge case, known officially as Police Exhibit 350. And before we get into exactly how it was found and why that discovery still doesn't sit right with people, let's take 30 seconds. Hey, if you're enjoying these investigations and you'd like to help Southern Static grow, I really appreciate you hitting the subscribe button. It genuinely helps more people discover these stories, and it allows me to keep researching and producing investigations like this every week. Right, let's get back to that cartridge case and how it turned Arthur Allan Thomas from a person of interest into a prime suspect. On 20th of October 1970, police seized Arthur Allan Thomas's rifle for a second time. This time they didn't give it back. They also seized his ammunition. For the next week, that rifle remained entirely in police possession. 7 days later, on the 27th of October 1970, detectives returned to the Crewe property for yet another search. During that search, Detective Sergeant Lenrick Johnson announced that he'd found something. Buried in a garden border outside the farmhouse, barely 2 to 3 inches down and ground detectives had already searched months earlier, was a single spent .22 cartridge. It was labelled Police Exhibit 350. At first glance, it looked like exactly the breakthrough police had been waiting for. Ballistics experts concluded microscopic markings on the casing matched Arthur Allan Thomas's rifle. Suddenly, police believed they could place his rifle at the murder scene, and if they could place his rifle there, they believed they could place Arthur Allan Thomas there too. Just like that, the direction of the investigation changed forever. Arthur Allan Thomas was no longer simply a man police wanted to speak to. He became their prime suspect, the man they believed had murdered Harvey and Jeannette Crewe. But here's the question. Was Exhibit 350 really the breakthrough detectives believed it was? Or had something happened that would eventually shake public confidence in New Zealand policing for generations? On paper, Police Exhibit 350 looked like the case was over. Not because anyone had seen Arthur Allan Thomas pull the trigger, not because he'd confessed, not because police had found fingerprints inside the Crewe farmhouse. All because of one tiny piece of brass, a spent .22 cartridge case. The prosecution would argue that this casing connected Arthur Allan Thomas's rifle directly to the murder scene. If that was true, then they believed they had their killer. Simple, clean, scientific. Except the deeper you investigate Exhibit 350, the less believable its story becomes. Forget what we now know about the Royal Commission and look at this as a detective would have back in 1970. If you were searching for evidence in a double murder, what would be near the top of your list? A spent cartridge case, physical evidence capable of linking a firearm to the scene. So here's the problem. The Crewe property had already been searched multiple times months earlier. And yet, it wasn't until the 27th of October 1970, more than 4 months after the murders, that Detective Sergeant Lenrick Johnson suddenly discovered Exhibit 350. That should immediately raise a question. How was it missed? Police maintained it had simply been overlooked. And to be fair, that can happen. No crime scene investigation is ever perfect. People do miss things, even experienced investigators. But this wasn't a cartridge hidden beneath floorboards. It wasn't buried beneath meters of soil. It wasn't concealed inside a wall cavity. It was 2 to 3 inches under a garden border, an area police had already gone over by hand. Does that prove it was planted? Nuh-uh, certainly doesn't. But it does create doubt, and good investigators don't ignore doubt. They investigate it. Then came another question. What condition should the casing have been in? Remember, according to the Crown's theory, Exhibit 350 had supposedly been sitting outside since the 17th of June 1970. That's over 4 months, exposed to the rain, mud, winter weather, and changing conditions. If that's true, its condition should reflect that. As years passed, experts began examining exactly that question. Did Exhibit 350 actually look like a cartridge that had spent months lying in a garden? Or did it look much newer than it should have? And then the case took another extraordinary turn, one that very few people know about. Later investigators examined not only where Exhibit 350 came from, but what it actually was, its manufacturing records, ammunition batch, and production date. The bullets that killed Harvey and Jeannette Crewe were part of an older ammunition pattern, stock that had stopped being produced sometime before 1963. But the manufacturing marks on Exhibit 350 point to a batch made in 1964 or later. Which means the cartridge police say linked Thomas's rifle to the killings may never have been capable of holding the actual bullets that killed them. And once you follow that thread, the whole theory behind Exhibit 350 starts to fall apart. If the evidence at the centre of your case starts looking questionable, what do? You stop, you reassess, you ask whether you had the right man. But that is absolutely not what happened. On the 11th of November 1970, just 2 weeks after Exhibit 350 was found, Arthur Allan Thomas was arrested. Now maybe that's coincidence, maybe detectives had already decided to arrest him. But it's pretty difficult to ignore the timing. For months, police had struggled to place Thomas at the scene, then the casings appeared. 2 weeks later, he's under arrest. I don't know about you, but that's a sequence I'd want explained. Thomas's trial began in Hamilton, around 120 kilometres south of Auckland, in early 1971. The prosecution built its case from Thomas's previous interest in Jeannette, his rifle, and other circumstantial evidence. But sitting right at the centre of everything was Exhibit 350. The prosecution told the jury that science had definitely linked Arthur Allan Thomas's rifle directly to the Crewe property. Science carries enormous weight in a courtroom. It sounds objective and certain. But forensic evidence is only ever as reliable as the people collecting it. And that's one of the biggest lessons this case teaches us. On the 2nd of March 1971, Arthur Allan Thomas was found guilty of murdering Harvey and Jeannette Crewe. He was sentenced to life imprisonment and taken to Paremaremo Prison, New Zealand's maximum security prison on the outskirts of Auckland. Just like that, a local Waikato farmer became one of New Zealand's most notorious convicted murderers. For many people, that should have been the end of the story. Case closed, justice served. Except Arthur Allan Thomas never stopped saying he was innocent. His wife Vivian never stopped believing him. Can you imagine what that must have felt like? The police are convinced, the jury is convinced, the newspapers are convinced, most of the country is convinced. And yet you still insist they've arrested the wrong man. This isn't just emotionally exhausting, it's incredibly lonely. Because you're no longer arguing with one detective, you're arguing with an entire justice system. Thankfully, some people were prepared to ask the difficult questions. One of the most important was investigative journalist Pat Booth. Booth refused to simply accept the verdict. He interviewed witnesses, examined documents, and questioned police evidence. The deeper he dug, the more uncomfortable he became. International author David Jalop would later do the same. Again, everything kept coming back to one tiny brass cartridge, Exhibit 350. The harder the investigators looked, the more difficult the casing became to explain. Because of Booth and Jalop's work, this story would not end with a guilty verdict, or even a retrial. Here's where I think that distinction actually matters. Police can make mistakes, witnesses can be wrong. Forensic science does evolve. But deliberately creating evidence to strengthen a weak case isn't error. It is straight up corruption. And in the next chapter of this story, one of the most powerful inquiries ever held in New Zealand will reach exactly that conclusion. The question is no longer, did Arthur Allan Thomas receive a fair trial? The question becomes, who planted Exhibit 350 in that garden? Arthur Allan Thomas should never have been convicted once, yet somehow he was convicted twice. After his first conviction in 1971, Thomas appealed. Questions about the evidence refused to disappear. Journalists continued digging, supporters continued fighting. And eventually, New Zealand's Court of Appeal ordered a retrial. This was the justice system's chance to stop and ask whether something had gone terribly wrong. A chance to correct a possible miscarriage of justice. Instead, on the 16th of April 1973, Arthur Allan Thomas was convicted all over again. 2 juries, 2 guilty verdicts, 2 life sentences, and to almost everyone watching, that should have been the end of the story. Except it wasn't. Outside the courtroom, the questions refused to die. Because by now, people weren't simply asking whether the jury had reached the wrong verdict. They were asking something way more disturbing. What if the jury had never been given the truth in the first place? There's an enormous difference between those two ideas. A jury can only make decisions based on the evidence placed in front of them. If that evidence is false, then justice never had a chance. Arthur Thomas returned to Paramaribo prison. In total, he would spend almost 9 years behind bars. 9 birthdays, 9 Christmases, 9 years watching the outside world continue on without you. 9 years carrying the label double murderer. Whether people believed him or not, those were years he was never going to get back. And while Arthur sat inside a prison cell, his wife Vivian Thomas refused to stop fighting. Honestly, I don't think history gives Vivian anywhere near enough credit. Wrongful convictions don't imprison one person, they imprison whole families. Every interview, every conversation, every newspaper headline, she had to stand there and continue saying, "It's lies, my husband is innocent." Try sitting with that for a second, carrying that when almost the entire country believes the opposite. She wasn't arguing against one detective. She was arguing against the entire New Zealand police, against Crown prosecutors, against judges, and against 2 separate juries. That takes extraordinary courage. Fortunately, Vivian wasn't fighting alone. Pat Booth and David Yallop's work was steadily turning public opinion, and the question they kept raising was becoming impossible for New Zealanders to ignore. If Exhibit 350 wasn't reliable, would Arthur Allan Thomas have ever been convicted at all? By 1979, public pressure had become impossible to ignore. The government established an independent review. That review concluded there was sufficient doubt surrounding the convictions. On the 17th of December 1979, Arthur Allan Thomas received a royal pardon. The following day he walked out of prison, almost 9 years after walking in. Picture that walk, through those prison gates feeling fresh air without razor wire above your head, seeing your family without prison officers standing between you. Free. But not really. Because freedom doesn't erase 9 lost years. It doesn't repair your reputation overnight. It doesn't undo everything you and your family had to live through. And it certainly doesn't answer the absolute biggest question of all. Who actually murdered Harvey and Jeannette Crewe? That answer, or at least part of it, would come the following year. In 1980, New Zealand established a Royal Commission of Inquiry. Now, for those of you watching outside New Zealand, a Royal Commission isn't just another police review. It isn't another appeal. It is one of the highest and most powerful forms of independent public inquiry our country can establish. Its job wasn't to protect police. Its job wasn't to protect Arthur Allan Thomas. Its job was to establish the truth. For months, the Commission worked through statements, forensic reports, and testimony from the original detectives, including Hutton and Johnson, the 2 men who had led the investigation from its very first week. Everything that had felt like a nagging doubt for over a decade was about to be tested formally, publicly, and under oath. And what it found shocked New Zealand. The Commission didn't simply criticise the investigation or blame overconfidence and tunnel vision. It reached a conclusion far more serious than that. The Royal Commission concluded that Police Exhibit 350 had been planted. Let that sit for a second. Not misplaced, not misunderstood, not accidentally contaminated, planted. According to the Royal Commission, senior detectives Bruce Hutton and Lenrick Johnson fabricated evidence by placing the cartridge case at the Crewe property after Arthur Allan Thomas's rifle had already been seized by police. If that's true, then Exhibit 350 wasn't evidence. It was a lie. A lie placed in the ground, collected as evidence, carried into court and presented to 2 juries, powerful enough to imprison an innocent man for almost a decade. To me, this is the exact moment the story stops being about a murder investigation and starts becoming a story about institutional corruption. The moment evidence is created instead of discovered, the investigation ends. From that point onward, the The objective is no longer finding the truth. It's protecting the story you've already decided to tell. That's why this series is called When the Badge Decays. Because when corruption exists, it damages public trust in every investigation that follows. Now here's something I've always struggled to understand. If a royal commission concluded detectives planted evidence, why was nobody ever prosecuted? It's a fair question. Bruce Hutton denied wrongdoing, Lenrick Johnson denied wrongdoing. Neither man was ever convicted of a criminal offence relating to Exhibit 350. An innocent man lost 9 years. A royal commission concluded evidence had been fabricated, yet no criminal court found anyone responsible. How does that happen? I genuinely don't know, and I would be interested to hear what you think. Then came another discovery. By the time later investigators wanted to re-examine Exhibit 350, it no longer existed. In 1973, police destroyed a large number of exhibits connected with the Crewe murders, including the single most controversial piece of evidence in the entire case. Exhibit 350, gone, destroyed, forever. Whatever the reasons for its destruction, one fact does remain. The most important exhibit in one of New Zealand's most controversial murder investigations can never again be independently examined. More than 30 years later, police conducted another review into the Crewe murders. Now it's important we remain fair because accuracy matters. That review didn't fully endorse every conclusion reached by the Royal Commission. Investigators said they couldn't establish with complete certainty that Exhibit 350 had definitely been planted. But here's the part that often gets overlooked. That same review accepted the casing's origins were deeply questionable. It accepted the cartridge probably couldn't have held either of the fatal bullets. An independent counsel concluded something incredibly important. Without Exhibit 350, the evidence against Arthur Allan Thomas wasn't sufficient to safely convict him. Even decades later, without that cartridge, the prosecution case was not strong enough. Which brings us right back to the question this case has really been asking all along. Not just what happened to a cartridge, but who took 2 lives and let another man serve the sentence for it. There's something about this case that I keep coming back to. Not Exhibit 350, not the Royal Commission, not even Arthur Allan Thomas. It's Harvey and Jeannette Crewe. Because somewhere beneath all the headlines, all the court cases, all the arguments over police corruption, 2 people were murdered. A little girl lost both of her parents. And more than 50 years later, nobody's ever been held accountable for killing them. To me, that's the real tragedy. Because when an investigation becomes focused on proving one suspect guilty, it stops asking the most important question of all. Who actually committed the crime? And if that happens, justice isn't simply delayed. It may disappear altogether. Picture the Crewe farmhouse today. The paddocks are still there, the hills still roll the same way they did in 1970. Somewhere on that land is the garden border where Exhibit 350 was supposedly buried, long since grassed over, giving nothing away. Follow the same road the ambulance and the police cars once took, past the letterbox where a worry stock agent once turned in. Down at the Waikato River, the water still moves the same slow brown current it did the night 2 bodies were weighted down and dropped beneath the surface. The land remembers nothing. The people who live there now know the story only secondhand. But somewhere in that quiet, ordinary landscape, the truth of who pulled the trigger is still out there. Buried just as deep as that cartridge case once was. Now let's step back and look at everything we've uncovered together. Harvey and Jeannette Crewe were murdered inside their farmhouse and dumped in the Waikato River. Their 18-month-old daughter Rochelle was left alone for almost 5 days. Medical evidence suggests somebody may have returned to keep her alive. A lead that was never investigated. The original crime scene was later described as grossly substandard. Potential evidence disappeared. A spent cartridge case suddenly appeared more than 4 months after the murders. Arthur Allan Thomas was convicted, then convicted again, and spent almost 9 years behind bars before a royal commission concluded the most important piece of evidence used against him had been planted. And despite everything that followed, Harvey and Jeannette's murderer has never officially been identified. When you lay it out like that, it's difficult not to ask yourself, how did it ever reach this point? This case teaches something bigger than one murder investigation. Trust must be earned. Police are given extraordinary powers to arrest, search, seize evidence, and ask juries to believe them. Those powers depend on honesty. When that trust is broken, the damage outlasts the case. Accountability doesn't weaken public trust. It strengthens it. There's another victim we shouldn't forget here. Rochelle Crewe. Go all the way back to the beginning of this episode for a moment. The cot, the silence. A little girl, too young to know her parents were never coming back, waiting in a house that had already told its story to no one. She was too young to understand why strangers suddenly surrounded her, too young to understand why her name would become permanently attached to one of New Zealand's darkest criminal cases. She didn't choose any of this. Neither did Harvey, neither did Jeannette. And according to the Royal Commission, neither did Arthur Allan Thomas. Every one of them became victims of decisions made by somebody else. And that little girl in the cot grew up carrying a question nobody has ever answered for her. Who was in the house, and why did they leave her alive without ever picking up a phone? So where does that leave us? More than half a century later, the murders remain officially unsolved. Arthur Allan Thomas's convictions are gone. His royal pardon remains. The Royal Commission's findings remain part of New Zealand's legal history. He did receive financial compensation, but compensation can't give someone back almost 9 years of their life. It can't erase the stigma. It can't repair the damage done to a family. And it certainly can't answer the question Harvey and Jeannette's loved ones have been asking since 1970. Who killed them? That's still something New Zealand doesn't know. Which brings me to the question I want to leave you with. Not what happened to a piece of brass in a police exhibit room, but this. If the Royal Commission was right, and Exhibit 350 really was planted, then the man convicted of this crime didn't do it. Which means somewhere, for more than 50 years, the person who actually murdered Harvey and Jeannette Crewe has never been named. Was the investigation so determined to prove Arthur Allan Thomas guilty that the real killer slipped away forever? Or do you think there's another explanation? I'd genuinely like to hear what you think. Next time on When the Badge Decays, we're going to stay with that same question. What happens when the people meant to protect the truth decide to bury it instead? Because Exhibit 350 wasn't the last time a badge would be trusted more than the evidence. We'll examine another New Zealand case that raises serious questions about police conduct. Until then, I'm Anthony. Thanks for joining me. Stay safe and stay out of the static.